Jack Mercer had seen death before, but nothing prepared him for the 4 graves hidden beneath the kitchen floor of the abandoned ranch. The injured mare that led him there knew the truth about the fresh corpse, buried without a marker, and someone was willing to kill again to keep that secret. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jack Mercer had never been a man who believed in signs from above. But when the chestnut mare limped into his camp that October morning, blood trailing from a gash on her foreleg, he wondered if maybe the universe was trying to tell him something. He had been riding the circuit for 3 years now, moving from ranch to ranch, taking whatever work he could find, never staying long enough to put down roots or make connections that might anchor him to one place. At 28, he had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age, and the weight of those years showed in the lines around his eyes and the careful way he approached each new day, as if expecting it to deliver another blow he would have to absorb alone. The mare was beautiful despite her injury, her coat the color of autumn leaves catching sunlight, her dark eyes intelligent and wary as she regarded him from the edge of his small campfire. She wore no saddle, no bridle, nothing to indicate where she had come from or who might be looking for her. The wound on her leg was fresh, perhaps a day old, clean enough that it hadn't been caused by wire or debris, but deliberate in a way that made Jack's stomach tighten with a familiar dread. He had seen injuries like this before in another life, in places he tried hard not to remember when the nightmares let him sleep at all. "Easy now, girl," he said softly, rising slowly from his bedroll so as not to startle her. His voice was rough from disuse. He had not spoken to another human being in nearly a week, and the sound of it seemed to hang in the cold morning air like smoke. The mare's ears flicked forward, considering him, weighing whether this dusty cowboy with the kind eyes and the worn boots represented safety, or another threat in a world that had already hurt her once. Jack moved with the patient grace of a man who understood that trust was something earned in increments, never demanded, and he kept his hands visible and his movements deliberate as he approached. She let him come within 10 feet before her nerve broke, and she shied away, favoring her injured leg in a way that told him the wound was worse than it appeared. He stopped immediately, giving her space, and settled down onto his heels to make himself smaller, less threatening. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, man and horse regarding each other across a distance measured not in feet but in accumulated betrayals and survival instincts. Jack talked to her in that low, steady voice, telling her about the weather and the landscape and nothing of any real importance, just filling the silence with sound that might eventually become comfort. When she finally allowed him to touch her, to run his calloused hands down her neck and shoulder, he felt something shift in his chest. Some small door he had thought permanently sealed, cracking open just enough to let in a sliver of light. The mare trembled under his touch, but she did not pull away, and Jack found himself wondering when was the last time he had let anyone close enough to see his own wounds, the ones that did not show on the surface but ran deep nonetheless. The gash on her leg was clean but would need tending, and Jack's supplies were limited to what he carried in his saddlebags, the bare necessities of a man who traveled light and expected little from the world. He had clean cloth for bandages, whiskey for disinfectant, and steady hands that remembered how to heal even when they sometimes shook with memories of all the things they had failed to fix. As he worked, cleaning the wound with careful efficiency, he noticed something else, a brand on the mare's flank that he did not recognize, an intricate design that seemed both old and oddly familiar, as if he had seen it before in dreams or distant memory. The mare bore the treatment with remarkable patience, as if she understood that pain now might mean relief later, and Jack found himself talking to her more freely than he had talked to anyone in years. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen and done, about the reasons he could not stay in one place long enough for the past to catch up with him. He told her about the ranch he had grown up on in Texas, about a father who had been hard but fair, and a mother whose gentleness had not been enough to protect her from the fever that took her when Jack was 12. He told her about the woman he had almost married, about how he had left 3 days before the wedding, because he woke up one morning and realized he was trying to build a life on a foundation of lies about who he really was and what he had done. By the time he finished bandaging the mare's leg, the sun was well up, burning off the morning mist that had settled over the prairie like a blanket. Jack's own horse, a reliable bay gelding named Tucker, had been watching the proceedings with patient interest, and now he nickered softly, as if to welcome this newcomer to their small, temporary family. Jack stood and stretched, his back protesting the hours spent bent over the mare's injury, and he looked out across the endless expanse of grassland that stretched in every direction, broken only by occasional stands of trees and the distant purple shadows of mountains he would probably never reach. The mare's presence changed his plans, such as they were. He had been heading south toward the winter work, following the same pattern he had followed for 3 years now, but an injured horse could not travel fast or far, and something about the way she had appeared, as if delivered by fate or providence, made him think that perhaps he was meant to discover where she had come from. The brand on her flank was his only clue, and though he had worked dozens of ranches across 3 territories, he had never seen its like before. Jack decided to follow the mare's trail backward, reasoning that wherever she had come from might hold answers about her injury and her owner. He broke camp with the efficiency of long practice, rolling his bedding tight and securing it behind Tucker's saddle, kicking dirt over the fire until not even a wisp of smoke remained. The mare watched him work, her dark eyes following his movements with an intelligence that made him think she understood more than horses usually did about human intentions and the unspoken contracts between species. He fashioned a lead rope from spare line and approached her slowly, half expecting her to bolt now that the immediate crisis of her injury had passed. But she stood calm as he slipped the makeshift halter over her head, and when he started walking, she followed without resistance, limping but steady, as if she had been waiting for someone to show her the way home. Tucker fell into step beside them, and the 3 of them made an odd procession across the empty prairie, a wandering cowboy and 2 horses heading toward a destination none of them could yet see. The trail was easy to follow at first. The mare's blood had left occasional drops on the pale grass, and her uneven gait had disturbed the ground in ways that told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. She had been running, not just walking, and running hard enough that she had not stopped even when the injury began to slow her down. Whatever had frightened her or driven her away from her home had been powerful enough to override the animal's natural instinct to seek shelter and rest. Jack found himself wondering what could inspire that kind of fear in a creature as magnificent as this mare, and the possibilities that came to mind were none of them good. By midday, they had covered perhaps 5 miles, moving slowly to accommodate the mare's injury and stopping frequently to let her rest. Jack shared his water with both horses, rationing it carefully because he was not sure when they would find more. The landscape around them had begun to change subtly, the flat prairie giving way to gentle rolls and swells that suggested they were approaching higher ground. In the distance, he could see a line of cottonwood trees, their leaves already turning gold with the approaching autumn, and where there were cottonwoods there was usually water. They reached the creek just as the sun began its long slide toward evening, and Jack let the horses drink their fill while he refilled his canteens and studied the ground for more signs of the mare's passage. The tracks here were clearer, preserved in the soft mud along the creek bank, and he could see that she had not come alone. There were other prints, human boots, heavy and deliberate, following the mare's trail and then diverging sharply, as if whoever had been tracking her had given up or been called away by some more urgent business. The sight of those boot prints sent a chill down Jack's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Someone had been chasing this horse, and recently enough that the tracks were still sharp-edged and clear. He knelt beside them, measuring their depth and spacing, reading the story they told. The person who had made them was large, probably a man, walking with purpose but not running, confident that he could catch his quarry without hurrying. That confidence suggested either stupidity or the kind of cruel certainty that came from having power over others, and Jack had seen enough of the latter to recognize it when he encountered its traces. He stood and looked around, suddenly aware of how exposed they were here beside the creek, how visible to anyone who might be watching from the low hills that surrounded them. His hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip, an old Colt that had seen him through the war and the hard years after, its weight familiar and reassuring. He had hoped to leave violence behind when he started drifting, but violence had a way of finding men like him, men who had learned its language too well to ever completely forget it. The mare nickered softly, as if sensing his sudden tension, and Jack forced himself to breathe slowly, to unclench his jaw and relax his shoulders. Getting spooked by boot prints and shadows was no way to approach an unknown situation. He needed more information before he could decide what, if anything, he was walking into. The smart thing would be to leave the mare here by the creek where she could rest and heal, to ride away and forget he had ever found her. But Jack had not done the smart thing in years, and the memory of her trusting eyes when she let him bandage her wound made the thought of abandoning her now sit poorly in his gut. They camped that night in a small hollow screened by brush, far enough from the creek that they would not be easily visible to anyone following the water. Jack did not light a fire, though the temperature dropped sharply once the sun disappeared, and he sat awake long into the night, listening to the prairie sounds and the steady breathing of the horses. The stars overhead were brilliant and cold, scattered across the sky like seeds thrown by some careless god, and Jack found himself thinking about all the nights he had spent like this, alone under open sky, belonging nowhere and to no one. The mare had settled down near Tucker, the two horses finding comfort in each other's presence, and Jack envied them that easy companionship. He had forgotten what it was like to trust another person enough to sleep peacefully beside them, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, to imagine a future that extended beyond the next job or the next town. The war had taken that from him, along with so much else, and 3 years of drifting had not given it back. But something about this mare, about the mystery of where she had come from and what had happened to her, had awakened something in Jack that he had thought was dead. Curiosity, perhaps, or purpose, or just the simple human need to see a story through to its end. Whatever it was, it pulled at him like gravity, like fate, like the irresistible current of a river he had no choice but to follow. When dawn broke gray and cold, Jack rose stiff and tired from his vigil. He checked the mare's bandage, pleased to see that the wound was clean and beginning to heal. They set out again, following the trail that grew fainter with each mile but never quite disappeared, and with every step, Jack felt himself moving closer to something he could not name, something that waited for him beyond the horizon like a promise or a threat. The landscape changed again on the third day, the gentle rolls giving way to rougher terrain, rocky outcroppings that thrust up through the prairie grass like the bones of some ancient creature trying to break free from the earth. Jack had to pick his way carefully, mindful of the mare's injury and the uneven ground that could turn an ankle or lame a horse with one wrong step. The air had grown thinner here, suggesting they were climbing steadily, even though the ascent was gradual enough to be almost imperceptible. In the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, he could see a dark smudge against the horizon that might have been trees or buildings, or just a trick of the light and his tired eyes. The mare seemed to grow more agitated as they traveled, her ears constantly swiveling, her nostrils flaring as she tested the wind for scents Jack's duller human senses could not detect. Whatever lay ahead, she recognized it, and her reaction told him that her memories of this place were not pleasant ones. He found himself talking to her more, nonsense words meant to soothe, and he wondered when he had started caring so much about the comfort of an animal he had known for less than a week. By afternoon, they had closed half the distance to that dark smudge on the horizon, and Jack could see that it was indeed a cluster of buildings, though from this distance he could not tell if they were occupied or abandoned. No smoke rose from any chimneys, no movement suggested life or activity, but that could mean anything in country this remote. Plenty of ranches operated with skeleton crews, especially this late in the season when the serious work of preparing for winter demanded that men spend their days in the fields and pastures rather than lingering around the main house. Jack called a halt near a small spring that bubbled up between two rocks, letting the horses drink while he studied the buildings through the battered spyglass he carried in his saddlebags. The glass was old, a relic from his army days, and one lens was cracked, but it still served its purpose well enough. Through it, he could see what had once been a substantial ranch, a two-story main house built of stone and timber, several outbuildings including a large barn, corrals that had fallen into disrepair, and what looked like a bunkhouse with half its roof missing. The place had the unmistakable air of abandonment, that particular quality of stillness that came from seasons of neglect rather than temporary absence. Weeds grew tall in what had once been a yard, doors hung crooked on broken hinges, and windows stared out like empty eye sockets in a skull. Yet the buildings themselves seemed sound enough, their bones good, even if their flesh was rotting. Someone had built this place to last, had invested time and money and hope in creating something permanent on the unforgiving prairie, and then something had happened to make them walk away from it all. Jack felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he studied the abandoned ranch, a sensation he had learned to recognize as the warning sign that he was about to involve himself in something that was none of his business. The smart move would be to leave the mare in one of the corrals with water and what little feed he could scrounge, then ride away before whatever had driven the previous occupants away could catch up with him too. But even as he thought it, he knew he would not do it. The mare had led him here for a reason, or perhaps he had followed her for a reason of his own, and walking away now would be just another form of running, and he was tired of running. They approached the ranch slowly, Jack's hand resting on his revolver and his eyes scanning the buildings and the surrounding landscape for any sign of danger. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Tucker's ears were forward, alert but not alarmed, and the mare had gone quiet in a way that suggested resignation rather than fear, as if she had known all along that this was where they were headed. The main gate stood open, its hinges rusted and one side dragging in the dirt. Jack dismounted and led the horses through, his boots raising small clouds of dust that hung in the still air like ghosts. Up close, the ranch looked even more melancholy, the signs of its former prosperity evident in details that decay had not yet completely erased. Someone had carved intricate designs into the porch railings, flowers and vines that spoke of a woman's touch or a man's devotion to beauty even in this harsh country. The barn doors bore traces of paint, red once but faded now to the color of dried blood, and above them hung a sign with that same brand he had seen on the mare's flank. Jack stood in the middle of the abandoned yard, turning slowly to take in the full scope of what he had found. This had not been just any ranch. The size of the buildings, the quality of their construction, the evidence of careful planning and substantial investment all suggested that this had been one of the premier spreads in the territory. Whatever had happened here had not been the simple failure of a marginal operation, but rather the catastrophic collapse of something that should have endured for generations. He tied the horses to a rail that seemed sturdy enough and approached the main house on foot, his footsteps echoing on the wooden porch. The front door was unlocked, which surprised him until he realized that in a place this remote, with no neighbors for miles, locks were more symbolic than practical. He pushed the door open slowly, half expecting it to fall off its hinges, but it swung smoothly, revealing an interior thick with dust and shadows. The house had been emptied of most furniture, But what remained told a story of sudden departure rather than careful planning. A kitchen table stood in the dining room, 3 of its 4 chairs still pushed neatly underneath as if waiting for a meal that would never be served. In the parlor, a book lay open on the floor, its pages water-stained and curled, as if someone had been reading it when they were interrupted and never returned to finish. Curtains hung in tatters at the windows, and the wallpaper peeled away from the walls in long strips that moved slightly in the drafts that whistled through cracks in the structure. Jack moved through the house slowly, his footsteps loud in the silence, opening doors and peering into rooms that revealed more questions than answers. A child's room on the 2nd floor, complete with a small bed and toys scattered across the floor. A master bedroom where the wardrobe doors stood open, revealing empty space where clothes had once hung. An office with shelves that bore the rectangular shadows of books long since removed or stolen, and a desk with all its drawers pulled out and left that way, their contents vanished. Whatever had driven the occupants away had happened quickly enough that they had not had time to pack carefully, but slowly enough that they had managed to take most of their valuable possessions with them. That ruled out fire or natural disaster, but left a wide range of other possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Jack stood in the office, running his hand over the dusty desk, and tried to imagine what could make someone abandon a property this substantial, this well-built, this full of evidence that it had been loved and tended. The answer, when he found it, was in the last place he looked. The cellar door was hidden beneath a woven rug in the kitchen, its presence revealed only when Jack's boot caught on the edge of the fabric and pulled it aside. The wooden trapdoor beneath was secured with a heavy padlock, rusted but still intact, suggesting that whatever lay below had been deliberately sealed away. Jack stared at it for a long moment, weighing his curiosity against his survival instincts, knowing that opening locked doors in abandoned places rarely led to anything good. But the mare had brought him here, or he had followed her here, and turning back now felt like a betrayal of whatever purpose had driven him across 3 days of prairie. He found a rusted axe in the barn, its handle split but still serviceable, and used it to break the lock with 3 solid blows that echoed through the empty house like gunshots. The trapdoor lifted with a groan of protesting hinges, releasing a smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and wrong that made Jack's stomach clench. He lit a lamp he had found in the parlor, checked his revolver one more time, and descended the narrow stairs into darkness that seemed to have weight and texture. The cellar was larger than he had expected, extending beyond the footprint of the house itself, its walls lined with stone that wept moisture in the lamplight. Shelves along one wall held the remains of provisions, jars of preserved food that had long since spoiled, sacks of grain that mice had turned into nests. But it was the far corner that drew Jack's attention, the place where the lamplight seemed to die rather than illuminate, where shadows gathered thick as smoke. 3 graves had been dug into the earthen floor, each marked with a wooden cross that bore a name and a date carved with what looked like knife work done in haste or grief. Sarah Brennan, age 34, died October 15, 1882. Thomas Brennan, aged 8, died October 16, 1882. Elizabeth Brennan, age 6, died October 17, 1882. Jack did some quick calculation. The dates were almost exactly 3 years ago, and whatever had killed this family had taken them one after another over the course of 3 days. But it was the 4th grave that made Jack's blood run cold. Unlike the others, it had no cross, no marker, just a mound of disturbed earth that looked newer than the rest, as if it had been dug recently, within the last few months or even weeks. Someone had come back to this abandoned ranch and buried something or someone in this cellar, and the secrecy of it, the wrongness of it, sent every instinct Jack possessed screaming that he should leave immediately. He forced himself to move closer, to examine the unmarked grave more carefully. The earth had been disturbed by something, animal claws perhaps, and through the gaps he could see fabric, the remains of what looked like a man's shirt. His hand shook as he set the lamp down and began to carefully clear away the loose soil, driven by a compulsion he did not fully understand to see what had been hidden here. The body was fresher than he had feared, but not fresh enough to identify easily. The face had been destroyed either by decomposition or deliberately. Jack could not tell which, but the clothes were those of a working man, denim and rough cotton, and the boots were good quality, expensive. Around the corpse's neck hung a silver chain, and when Jack pulled it free, he found a pocket watch attached, its case engraved with initials he could not make out in the uncertain lamplight. He sat back on his heels, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. Someone had killed this man and buried him in secret in the cellar of an abandoned ranch, which suggested that whoever was responsible either owned the property or felt confident they would not be discovered. The older graves provided a grim context. A family wiped out 3 years ago by what the date suggested was disease. Their bodies buried here by someone who had cared enough to mark their resting places, but not enough to give them a proper cemetery burial. Jack climbed out of the cellar with the pocket watch clutched in his hand and the smell of death clinging to his clothes. He stumbled out onto the porch and breathed deeply of the clean prairie air, trying to clear his lungs and his mind. The mare was watching him from where he had tied her, her dark eyes knowing, as if she had anticipated what he would find. Of course she had known, Jack realized with a chill. She had come from this place, had been here when that man was buried, had perhaps witnessed the murder itself and been injured in her panic to escape. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, painting the abandoned ranch in shades of gold and amber that seemed obscene given what lay beneath the kitchen floor. Jack knew he should leave, should ride to the nearest town and report what he had found to whatever passed for law in this part of the territory. But towns were days away in any direction, and whoever had committed murder here might return at any moment to check on their hidden grave. The thought of being caught here, of having to explain his presence to a killer, made Jack's mouth go dry. He examined the pocket watch more carefully in the better light outside. The initials engraved on the case were HBM, and when he opened it, he found a photograph tucked inside, a tintype of a young woman with serious eyes and dark hair pulled back severely. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "To Henry, with all my love, Margaret, June 1878. So the dead man had a name, Henry, and someone named Margaret had loved him once, had given him this watch as a token of that love. Jack stood in the yard of the abandoned ranch, holding the watch and trying to decide what to do next. Every instinct he had developed over 3 years of drifting told him to mount Tucker, take the mare, and ride away as fast as the horses could carry him. This was not his fight, not his problem, not his responsibility. He owed nothing to the dead man in the cellar or to the family buried beside him. His only obligation was to his own survival, and staying here was the opposite of survival. But something had shifted in Jack over the past 3 days, some long dormant sense of justice or duty or simple human decency that made the thought of riding away stick in his throat like a bone. The mare had led him here, or he had followed her here, and he had found something that demanded action, that required someone to bear witness and perhaps to seek accountability. The war had taught him that the world was full of evil that went unpunished, but it had also taught him that sometimes, just sometimes, one person could make a difference if they were willing to pay the price. He put the watch in his pocket and began a more thorough search of the ranch, looking for clues about who had lived here, who had died here, and who had returned to add one more body to the collection in the cellar. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of red and purple, and Jack knew he would have to make camp soon. But he also knew with a certainty that surprised him that he was not leaving this place until he understood what had happened here and why. Jack made camp in the barn rather than the house, unable to shake the feeling that sleeping under the same roof as those graves would be an invitation to nightmares worse than the ones that already plagued him. The barn was in better condition than he had initially thought, its roof mostly intact and its walls solid enough to provide shelter from the wind that had picked up as darkness fell. He unsaddled Tucker and checked the mare's bandage again, pleased to see that the wound was healing cleanly despite the hard travel of the past days. The horses seemed uneasy in their new surroundings, their ears constantly swiveling toward sounds Jack could not hear, their nostrils flaring as they tested the air for threats. He fed them what little grain he had left and made sure they had water from the well he had found behind the barn, its mechanism rusty but still functional. Then he settled himself in a corner where he could watch the door and tried to make sense of what he had discovered. The pocket watch lay on the ground beside him, its silver case catching the lamplight as he turned it over in his hands. Henry Brennan Mitchell, he thought, testing the name against the initials on the watch. If the dates on the graves were accurate, Sarah, Thomas, and Elizabeth Brennan had died 3 years ago in October, right around this same time of year. Had Henry been Sarah's husband, the father of those children? Had he survived whatever killed them, only to meet his own end here months or weeks ago? Jack opened his saddlebag and pulled out the journal he kept, a battered leather book where he recorded the places he had been and the things he had seen, a habit from his army days that he had never quite broken. He wrote quickly by lamplight, documenting everything he had found, the dates on the graves, the description of the unmarked burial, the pocket watch and its inscription. If something happened to him here, if whoever had killed Henry Brennan Mitchell returned and decided that Jack knew too much, at least there would be some record of what he had discovered. As he wrote, he became aware of a sound outside the barn, faint but distinct, the creak of a board under weight. Jack set down his journal and drew his revolver in one smooth motion, moving to the side of the door where he would have a clear shot at anyone who entered. His heart was hammering in his chest, but his hands were steady, muscle memory from the war taking over, where conscious thought might have failed him. The door swung open slowly, and a figure stepped into the lamplight. For a moment, Jack's finger tightened on the trigger, and then he saw that it was not a man but a boy, perhaps 14 or 15, thin and ragged, with wild eyes that darted around the barn like a trapped animal looking for escape. The boy froze when he saw Jack, and Jack could see the calculation happening behind those eyes, weighing the distance to the door against the speed of a bullet. "Easy, son," Jack said, lowering the revolver but not holstering it. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy did not relax, but he did not run either, and Jack took that as a good sign. "Are you hungry?" The question seemed to catch the boy off guard, and after a moment he nodded. Jack gestured to his saddlebag with his free hand. "There's jerky and hardtack in there. Help yourself." The boy moved like a wild thing, quick and nervous, grabbing the food and retreating to the far corner of the barn before he began to eat. Jack watched him, noting the way his clothes hung loose on his frame, the hollow look in his cheeks that spoke of long hunger. This was not a boy who had missed a meal or two. This was a boy who had been starving for weeks or months. "What's your name?" Jack asked when the boy had taken the edge off his hunger. The boy looked at him for a long moment before answering, as if weighing whether the truth was safe to tell. "Daniel," he said finally, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Daniel Brennan." The name hit Jack like a physical blow. Brennan, the same name on 3 of the graves in the cellar. He studied the boy more carefully, seeing now the resemblance to the dates and ages he had read. If Thomas Brennan had been 8 when he died 3 years ago, and if this boy was his older brother, the timeline fit perfectly. "You lived here," Jack said carefully. "This was your family's ranch." Daniel nodded, his eyes filling with tears he clearly did not want to shed. "My ma, my brother and sister, they all died. The fever came and took them one after another, and Pa and me, we buried them in the cellar because the ground was too frozen for digging proper graves outside." "And your father?" Jack asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "Dead too," Daniel whispered. murdered by the man who wanted this land. The confirmation of Jack's suspicions brought no satisfaction, only a grim certainty that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. "Who?" he asked. "Who killed your father?" Before Daniel could answer, the sound of horses approaching cut through the night air. Multiple riders, coming fast, their hoofbeats drumming against the hard prairie ground like war drums. Daniel's face went white with terror, and he scrambled to his feet, looking wildly around for a place to hide. "It's him," the boy gasped. "It's Nathaniel Cross. He's come back." Jack moved quickly, extinguishing the lamp and plunging the barn into darkness. Through the gaps in the walls, he could see torches approaching, perhaps 5 or 6 riders, and he knew with absolute certainty that they were not here for any good purpose. He pulled Daniel down beside him behind a row of feed barrels, his revolver in one hand and his other hand on the boy's shoulder to keep him from panicking and running. The riders entered the yard with the confidence of men who believed they owned the place, their torches casting wild shadows that danced across the buildings. Jack could hear them talking, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. He recognized the tone, if not the words, the casual arrogance of men who had power and enjoyed using it. "Check the house," one of them called out, his voice rough and commanding. "If anyone's here, I want them found." Jack felt Daniel trembling beside him and squeezed the boy's shoulder in what he hoped was reassurance. The situation had gone from mysterious to deadly in the space of moments, and Jack found himself calculating odds and possibilities with the cold detachment that had kept him alive through years of war and wandering. 6 men against 1, poor odds by any measure, but he had faced worse and survived. The real problem was Daniel, the boy who had information that someone clearly wanted to keep buried along with Henry Brennan Mitchell. The sound of boots on wood told him that the riders had entered the house, and Jack knew they had only minutes before the search expanded to the outbuildings. He leaned close to Daniel and whispered, barely breathing the words, "Is there another way out of here?" The boy nodded and pointed to the back wall where Jack could just barely make out the outline of a small door, probably used for moving hay in and out. "When I tell you to run, you run," Jack whispered. "Get to the horses and ride as far and fast as you can. Don't stop until you reach a town with a sheriff and tell him everything you know about Nathaniel Cross and what happened here." Daniel started to protest, but Jack cut him off. "This is not up for discussion, boy. Someone needs to survive to tell this story, and it's going to be you." Outside, the riders had finished searching the house and were spreading out across the yard. One of them was heading toward the barn, his torch held high, and Jack knew that discovery was seconds away. He checked his revolver one more time, made sure he had a clear line of sight to the door, and prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. The mare and Tucker were stirring restlessly in their stalls, sensing the tension and the approaching threat. The barn door swung open, and torchlight flooded in, momentarily blinding. Jack raised his revolver, his finger on the trigger, and in that frozen moment before violence erupted, he thought about all the choices that had led him to this place, to this abandoned ranch with its buried secrets and its ghosts demanding justice. He thought about the injured mare who had stumbled into his camp and the boy hiding beside him, who deserved a chance at a future beyond fear and running. Then the shooting started, and there was no more time for thought, only for action and survival, and the grim work of making sure that at least one person left this place alive to tell the truth about what had happened here. Jack's first shot took the torch from the hand of the man entering the barn, the impact sending sparks flying and plunging the interior back into darkness before the man could get a clear look at who was inside. The rider cursed and stumbled backward, reaching for his own weapon, and Jack used those precious seconds to shove Daniel toward the back door. "Go now," he hissed, and the boy went scrambling through the small opening like a rabbit fleeing a fox. The barn erupted into chaos as the other riders converged on the sound of gunfire. Jack moved away from where he had been crouched, knowing that muzzle flash would give away his position and that staying in one place was suicide. He fired twice more, carefully aimed shots that sent the men diving for cover, buying time for Daniel to reach the horses and escape into the darkness. The mare's frightened whinny told him the boy had made it, and then he heard the thunder of hooves as Daniel fled into the night. Return fire came quickly, bullets punching through the barn walls and sending splinters flying. Jack felt something hot graze his shoulder, not a direct hit, but close enough to make him aware of how thin the margin between life and death had become. He reloaded in the darkness with practiced efficiency, his fingers finding each cartridge by touch alone, and tried to count how many shots he had heard. 4 men had fired, which meant at least 2 were holding back, either out of ammunition concerns or because they were circling around to flank him. A voice cut through the gunfire, commanding and cold. "Whoever you are in there, you're making a mistake. This is private property and you're trespassing. Come out with your hands up and maybe we can settle this like civilized men." Jack almost laughed at the absurdity of it. This talk of civilization and legality from a man who had murdered Henry Brennan and buried him in a cellar alongside the graves of his wife and children. But he kept silent, moving again to a new position near the back of the barn where he could watch both the main door and the sides. The voice came again, closer now, and Jack recognized the calculated patience in it, the tone of a man who was used to getting what he wanted through a combination of intimidation and persistence. "My name is Nathaniel Cross, and I own this land legally and properly. Whatever story that boy has been telling you is lies, the fantasies of a child who can't accept that his father sold out and moved on. If you leave now, I'll forget this ever happened." Jack considered his options in the darkness, weighing the odds and the possible outcomes. He could try to fight his way out, but 6 against 1 was poor mathematics no matter how you calculated it. He could surrender and hope that Cross was telling the truth about settling things peacefully, but the body in the cellar argued strongly against that particular fantasy. Or he could keep them occupied here long enough for Daniel to get far enough away that he could not be caught, and then accept whatever consequences came from that choice. The decision, when he made it, surprised him with its clarity. He had spent 3 years running from responsibility and consequence, drifting from place to place with no ties and no purpose beyond simple survival. But the injured mare had led him here, or he had followed her here, and he had found something that demanded more than running. He had found a boy who needed protecting and a dead man who needed avenging and a story that needed telling. "I know what you did to Henry Brennan," Jack called out, his voice steady, despite the fear that made his hands want to shake. "I know about the graves in the cellar and the murder you committed and buried. The boy is gone now, riding to the nearest town to tell the law everything he knows, and there's nothing you can do to stop him." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the nervous movements of Tucker in his stall and the crackle of the dropped torch burning itself out in the dirt. Then Cross laughed, a sound without humor or warmth. "You're a fool," he said. "The nearest town with a real lawman is 3 days' ride from here, and that boy is half-starved and riding a lame horse. My men will run him down before he makes it 10 miles. Jack felt his stomach drop. The mayor, in his concern for getting Daniel away, he had not considered that the injured horse would slow the boy down, make him easy prey for mounted men who knew the country. His gesture of sacrifice had been for nothing if Daniel was caught. Worse than nothing, because now he had given away the one piece of information that might have kept the boy safe, that someone else knew the truth about what had happened here. But Cross had made a mistake too, and Jack recognized it immediately. The man had revealed that he knew about the mare's injury, which meant he knew about the mare, which meant he was the one who had hurt her, probably while trying to catch Daniel. It was a small slip, but it confirmed everything the boy had said and gave Jack something he had been lacking, absolute certainty that he was on the right side of this fight. "How many other people has your greed killed?" Jack asked, still moving in the darkness, making his way toward the far wall, where he had noticed earlier a gap in the boards large enough to squeeze through. How many other families have you destroyed to add another acre to your holdings? More silence, and then the sound of movement outside as Cross's men repositioned themselves. Jack knew what was coming next. The final assault. The rush from multiple directions that would overwhelm any defense he could mount. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they came at him in force, 2 minutes to find a way out or make peace with dying in this abandoned barn, defending a boy he barely knew. The gap in the boards was smaller than he had hoped, and squeezing through it cost him precious seconds and a fair amount of skin. He emerged into the space between the barn and a smaller shed, a narrow alley that offered some cover but no real escape route. Above him, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out beneath them, and Jack found himself thinking about all the men he had killed in the war, wondering if any of them had looked up at these same stars in their final moments. Tucker's frightened neigh from inside the barn told him the assault had begun, and he heard boots kicking in the back door, voices shouting as men realized their prey had escaped. Jack ran, keeping low, heading for the main house because it was the only structure large enough to offer multiple defensive positions. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed it, and his lungs ached from the exertion and the fear, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying, and he was not ready to die yet. He made it to the porch as the first shots rang out, the men having spotted his movement in the moonlight. The front door was still unlocked from his earlier exploration, and he threw himself through it, rolling to the side as bullets chewed into the door frame where he had been standing. The house was dark and full of shadows, familiar from his earlier search but transformed by fear and adrenaline into a maze of potential death traps. Jack scrambled up the stairs to the second floor, his mind racing through possibilities and tactics. The high ground was always an advantage in a fight, and from the upstairs windows he would have a clear field of fire on anyone trying to approach. But it also meant he would be trapped if they decided to burn the house down around him, a common enough tactic when dealing with barricaded enemies. The body in the cellar flashed through his mind, Henry Brennan Mitchell, who had probably made some similar calculation about defensible positions before Nathaniel Cross had killed him. From the window of the child's bedroom, the one that had been Thomas or Elizabeth's before the fever took them, Jack could see Cross's men spreading out across the yard, taking positions behind the well, the corral fence, and various pieces of equipment. They moved with military precision, which suggested either army experience or extensive practice in this kind of violence. Cross himself stood near the gate, a tall figure illuminated by moonlight, directing his men with calm authority. Jack fired 3 careful shots through the window, not expecting to hit anything but establishing that he was armed and willing to fight. The men below scattered for cover, and he heard Cross shouting orders, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. The words were not for Jack's benefit, but for his men, instructions about maintaining perimeter and watching the back exits, tactical language that confirmed Jack's suspicion about military experience. "You're only making this harder on yourself," Cross called up to the house. "That boy is a liar and a thief. His father sold me this land fair and square before he ran off, and the boy's been squatting here ever since, stealing from my cattle and vandalizing my property. Whatever he told you is a fiction designed to make you feel sorry for him." The lie was delivered with such confidence, such practiced ease, that Jack could imagine how many times Cross had told it before, to neighbors and lawmen and anyone else who might have asked inconvenient questions about the Brennan family's disappearance. It was a good lie, comprehensive and difficult to disprove, especially if the only witness was a half-starved boy with no proof except his own testimony and a body that Cross could easily claim to know nothing about. "I found Henry Brennan's body," Jack called back, "in the cellar, buried next to his wife and children. That's not the work of a man who sold his land and moved on. That's murder, and you know it." He heard Cross say something to his men, too quiet to make out the words, and then the response came, still calm, but with an edge to it now. "If there is a body in that cellar, and I'm not saying there is, it could have been put there by anyone. Maybe the boy killed his own father in some dispute and has been living here in the ruins of his crime ever since. Have you considered that possibility, stranger? Jack had to admit it was clever, the way Cross was trying to turn the situation around to plant doubt about Daniel's innocence while maintaining his own distance from any knowledge of the murder. In a courtroom, without physical evidence linking Cross to the crime, the lie might even work. The thought filled Jack with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. "The boy is 14 years old," Jack said. "You really think anyone is going to believe he killed his father and buried him in secret?" Cross did not answer immediately, and Jack used the silence to reload his revolver and assess his situation. He had perhaps 20 rounds remaining, enough for a sustained fight but not an extended siege. No food except what was in his saddlebags in the barn. No water except what remained in his canteen. If Cross decided to wait him out, the mathematics of survival became very simple and very grim. "What's your name, stranger?" Cross asked, and there was something different in his voice now, a note of curiosity that suggested he was genuinely interested in the answer. "I like to know the names of men who cause me trouble." "Jack Mercer," Jack replied, seeing no reason to hide his identity. "Late of the Union Army, currently employed in the occupation of not minding my own business." He heard what might have been a chuckle from below, and Cross spoke again, his tone almost conversational. "I was Army too, Confederate cavalry under General Forrest. Lost everything in the war and came out here to start over, just like thousands of other men trying to rebuild their lives on the frontier. This land was available. The Brennan family was willing to sell, and I made them a fair offer. If Henry Brennan is dead, and again I'm not saying he is, it's no concern of mine. Except he never sold," Jack said, "and his family died of fever 3 years ago, which means your story about buying the land from him recently is a lie. You wanted this ranch and you took it, first by waiting for disease to do most of your work for you, and then by killing the one man who stood between you and ownership." The silence that followed was longer this time, and Jack could almost feel Cross recalculating his approach. The man was smart enough to recognize that the simple lies were not working, that Jack had enough information to be dangerous. The question was whether Cross would try a different tactic or simply resort to the violence that had probably always been his preferred solution. "Let me make you an offer," Cross said finally. "You ride out of here right now tonight, and I'll give you $100 for your trouble. Forget about the boy, forget about whatever you think you found in that cellar, and go back to drifting or whatever it was you were doing before you stuck your nose into my business. No one needs to die here tonight." Jack considered the offer, not because he was tempted to take it, but because he was trying to understand Cross's motivation for making it. $100 was substantial money, more than most drifting cowboys saw in 6 months, and the fact that Cross was willing to pay it suggested he was genuinely worried about something. Perhaps about the boy getting away, or perhaps about the attention that would come if a dead body was found in a house Cross was claiming to own legally. "And if I refuse?" Jack asked. Cross's answer came quickly, the friendly tone dropping away to reveal something harder underneath. "Then you die here, and I bury you next to Henry Brennan, and the story becomes that 2 trespassers had a falling out over stolen property. The law won't look too hard at the death of a drifter with no family and no fixed address. I can promise you that." The brutal honesty of it was almost refreshing after the lies, and Jack found himself almost respecting Cross's directness. At least now they both understood the stakes and the terms. Jack would leave and live or stay and die, and whatever choice he made would determine whether Daniel's story ever got told or was buried along with everyone else who had stood in Nathaniel Cross's way. Jack thought about the mare who had led him here, about the trust in her eyes when she let him bandage her wound. He thought about Daniel, 14 years old and starving, trying to survive in the ruins of his family's dreams, while the man who had destroyed them claimed ownership of the ashes. He thought about Henry Brennan Mitchell, who had probably made the same calculations Jack was making now, weighing survival against justice and choosing wrong. The smart choice, the survival choice, was to take the money and ride away. Jack had no connection to this place, no obligation to these people, no reason to throw his life away for a boy he had just met and a dead man he had never known. 3 years of drifting had taught him that heroes died young and survivors learned to look the other way when violence and injustice were someone else's problem. But something had changed in Jack over the past few days, some dormant part of himself awakening like seeds after rain. The mayor's injury had called to something in him that recognized suffering and wanted to ease it. Daniel's terror had touched something that remembered what it felt like to be young and helpless and alone, and the graves in the cellar had spoken to something that believed, against all evidence and experience, that some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were impossible. "I'm not leaving," Jack called down, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "And that boy is going to reach the law, and when he does, there's going to be questions about this place that your lies won't be able to answer." The gunfire that erupted in response was immediate and overwhelming, a concentrated barrage that sent bullets crashing through every window on the second floor. Jack threw himself flat, covering his head as glass and splinters rained down around him. The fury of it was shocking, a display of raw violence that told him Cross had abandoned any pretense of negotiation or peaceful resolution. When the shooting paused, probably so the men could reload, Jack crawled to a different window and risked a quick look outside. What he saw made his blood run cold. 2 of Cross's men were approaching the house with torches, clearly intending to set it ablaze and burn him out. The tactic was crude but effective, and Jack knew he had only moments to act before the house became an inferno with him trapped inside. He fired at the torchbearers, his shots forcing them to drop back but not stopping their advance entirely. They were determined, and he could see Cross directing them, pointing out safe approaches and coordinating their movements. The man fought like a general, tactical and patient, willing to sacrifice time and resources to achieve his objective. Jack's mind raced through options, all of them bad. He could not stay in the house if they set it on fire, but leaving meant facing 6 armed men in open ground with no cover. He could try to make it to the barn where Tucker was still tied, but that meant crossing the yard under fire with minimal chance of success. Or he could go down into the cellar and hope they did not think to look there, but that meant trapping himself underground with only one exit. The cellar was Jack's only option, terrible as it was, and he made the decision with the cold clarity that came from accepting that all his choices were bad ones. He ran down the stairs as flames began to lick at the front porch, the dry wood catching with frightening speed. The kitchen was filling with smoke, and Jack pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth as he yanked open the cellar door and descended into the darkness that had haunted him since he first discovered its secrets. The graves were barely visible in the gloom, mounds of earth that marked the end of the Brennan family's dreams. Jack moved past them quickly, trying not to think about the bodies beneath the soil or the man he was about to join, if he could not find another way out. His lamp had been left in the barn, so he worked by feel and the faint glow of firelight filtering down through the kitchen floorboards as the house burned above him. The cellar was larger than it first appeared, extending beyond the house's foundation in a way that suggested it had been dug for storage or perhaps as a root cellar before the house was even built. Jack felt his way along the stone walls, searching for any opening, any passage that might lead to safety. His fingers found moisture and then a draft of cool air, and he followed it to a narrow gap in the stonework that looked like it had been deliberately concealed behind empty crates. The passage was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the thought of getting stuck in this dark tunnel while the house burned above him and Cross's men waited outside made his throat tighten with panic. But staying was certain death, and this passage at least offered the possibility of escape. So Jack forced himself into the gap and began to crawl forward, pushing with his feet and pulling with his hands. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, sloping gently downward and then leveling out, its walls rough stone that scraped his shoulders and back. Jack lost track of time in the darkness, measuring distance only by the burning in his lungs and the ache in his muscles. Behind him, he could hear the muffled roar of the fire consuming the house, and he wondered if Cross was watching the flames with satisfaction, believing that Jack Mercer had died in the blaze he had created. The passage ended abruptly in a wooden door, so rotten that it fell apart when Jack pushed against it. He emerged into fresh air and starlight, gasping and covered in dirt, somewhere on the far side of the ranch from where Cross's men were positioned. The tunnel had been an escape route, probably built by Henry Brennan or his father before him, a precaution against Indian raids or other dangers that frontier families learned to prepare for. Jack lay on the ground for a moment, letting his racing heart slow and his breathing return to normal. From his position, he could see the house fully engulfed in flames, the fire lighting up the night sky like a beacon. Cross's men were silhouetted against the blaze, watching and waiting for any sign that their target had survived. They would wait until morning, Jack guessed, until the ashes cooled enough to search for his body, and only then would they realize he had escaped. The smart move was to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and this place, before Cross discovered he was still alive. But Tucker was still in the barn, and Jack found he could not abandon the horse that had carried him faithfully for 3 years. More than that, he could not abandon the principle of the thing, the idea that men like Nathaniel Cross should not be allowed to burn and kill and steal without consequence. Jack circled wide around the ranch, using the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain from his earlier exploration to stay hidden. The barn was on the opposite side of the yard, from where the tunnel had emerged, which meant he would have to cross open ground to reach it. But Cross's men were focused on the burning house, their attention drawn to the spectacle of destruction, and Jack used their distraction to his advantage. He moved like a shadow, low and fast, covering the distance to the barn in a crouching run that left him breathless but undetected. The barn door was still open from the earlier firefight, and Jack slipped inside to find Tucker nervous but unharmed. The horse recognized him immediately, nickering softly, and Jack took a moment to run his hands over the animal's neck in greeting and reassurance. Saddling Tucker in the dark was a challenge, but Jack's fingers knew the routine by heart, and within minutes he was ready to ride. The question was where. North toward the nearest town seemed logical, following Daniel's path and hoping to catch up with the boy before Cross's men did. But something made Jack pause, some instinct or intuition that whispered there was more to be done here before he could leave with a clear conscience. The pocket watch was still in his pocket. Henry Brennan Mitchell's watch with its engraved initials and the photograph of Margaret who had loved him. Jack pulled it out and held it in his palm, feeling its weight, and thought about the man who had carried it, who had watched his family die one by one, who had probably known that Cross would come for him eventually but had stood his ground anyway. A man like that deserved better than an unmarked grave in a cellar and a murderer claiming his land as legitimate property. Daniel deserved better than to spend the rest of his life running and hiding from Cross's reach. And the truth, Jack realized, deserved a better advocate than a drifting cowboy with no ties and no credibility, whose death in a burning house would be marked only by a brief mention in some territorial newspaper, if it was mentioned at all. Jack looked out at the burning house and the men gathered around it, and an idea began to form in his mind, desperate and dangerous but possible if he was willing to take the risk. Cross believed he had won, believed that Jack was dead, and Daniel would be caught before he reached help, believed that his lies and his violence had secured his claim to the Brennan Ranch permanently. That confidence, that certainty of victory, was a weakness that could be exploited by someone willing to be bold. Jack led Tucker out the back of the barn, moving quietly until they were far enough away that mounting and riding would not be heard over the roar of the flames. Then he swung into the saddle and turned not north toward safety, but south, back toward the direction Cross had come from, toward what Jack guessed was Cross's own ranch and headquarters. If Cross was here with his men, burning houses and hunting boys, then his home place was likely undefended or lightly guarded. And if Jack's guess about the man was right, if Cross was the kind who kept records and documentation to support his claims of legitimate business dealings, then those records would be at his ranch, probably in an office or safe where he thought they were secure from prying eyes. The ride south was tense, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a possible warning that Cross had realized his mistake and sent men after him. But the night remained quiet except for the wind and the distant sounds of the burning ranch, and Jack pushed Tucker hard, knowing that speed was his only advantage now. If he could reach Cross's place, find evidence of the man's crimes, and get back to Daniel before Cross's men caught the boy, then maybe, just maybe, they could turn this disaster into something resembling justice. Tucker covered the miles with the steady determination of a horse that understood urgency, and as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jack saw buildings ahead, a ranch that was everything the Brennan place had been before Cross destroyed it. Prosperous, well-maintained, with good fences and fat cattle, it was the picture of frontier success built on theft and murder. Jack approached carefully, watching for guards or hands who might be up early for morning chores. But the place seemed quiet, most of Cross's men presumably still at the Brennan ranch waiting for the fire to die down. He tied Tucker in a grove of trees within easy running distance and made his way on foot toward the main house, his revolver drawn and his senses alert for any sign of danger. The house was locked, but the window to what looked like an office was not latched securely, and Jack managed to force it open with minimal noise. He climbed through and found himself in a room that confirmed all his suspicions about Nathaniel Cross. The walls were lined with maps and documents, property surveys and deeds, all marked with the same meticulous care that spoke of a man who planned his crimes as carefully as legitimate businessmen planned their ventures. Jack worked quickly, gathering papers that looked important and stuffing them into his shirt. A ledger on the desk caught his attention, its pages filled with notations that seemed to track Cross's various land acquisitions over the past decade. Jack flipped through it, seeing pattern after pattern of the same approach: families who had died or disappeared, properties that had somehow ended up in Cross's possession, always with documentation that looked legal on the surface, but bore the subtle marks of forgery when examined closely. Jack was so focused on the ledger that he did not hear the footsteps in the hall until it was almost too late. He dove behind the desk as the door opened, his hand on his revolver, and watched as an elderly woman in a nightdress entered carrying a lamp. She was perhaps 60, her gray hair in a long braid, and she moved with the careful precision of someone whose joints no longer cooperated with the urgency her mind might feel. The woman saw the open window immediately, and her eyes moved to the desk where papers were scattered in obvious disarray. She set down her lamp and spoke in a voice that carried no fear, only a weary resignation that suggested she had been expecting something like this for a long time. "You can come out, whoever you are. I am not going to scream or raise an alarm." Jack stood slowly, keeping his revolver visible but not pointed at her. The woman studied him with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, taking in his dirt-covered clothes, the burn marks on his sleeves from the fire, and the exhaustion that must have been written plainly on his face. "You are the one from the Brennan place," she said. It was not a question. Nathaniel came home hours ago, gathered his men, and rode out saying there was a trespasser who needed to be dealt with. I assume that trespasser was you. Jack nodded, uncertain what to make of this woman who seemed neither surprised nor upset to find a stranger robbing her husband's office. The woman gestured to the papers he had gathered. "Looking for evidence of my husband's crimes, I imagine. You will not find much that would stand up in a territorial court. Nathaniel is too careful for that, too skilled at making murder look like misfortune, and theft looked like legitimate business. "Who are you?" Jack asked. The woman smiled sadly. "I am Catherine Cross, Nathaniel's wife of 32 years and the greatest regret of my life. When I married him, he was a different man, or perhaps I was simply too young and foolish to see him clearly. By the time I understood what he was, I had nowhere to go and no way to support myself except through his prosperity." She moved to the desk and pulled open a drawer that Jack had not yet searched. Inside was a small metal box, and she opened it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. From the box, she pulled a stack of letters bound with string, and Jack saw that they were addressed to various territorial officials, sheriffs, and judges. "These are copies of every letter I have written over the past 10 years, she said quietly, trying to tell anyone about what Nathaniel has done. Not one of them was ever answered. Either they did not believe a wife testifying against her husband, or Nathaniel's money and influence reached them before my words could. "Why are you helping me?" Jack asked, and Catherine looked at him with eyes that held a depth of sadness he could barely comprehend. "Because I am tired of being complicit in evil through my silence, because the Brennan family deserved better than the fate Nathaniel gave them, and because you are the first person who has ever cared enough to risk your life trying to stop him." She handed him the letters and then pulled out another document, this one an original deed to the Brennan property, showing that it had never been sold, that Cross's claim was entirely fraudulent. "Henry Brennan refused to sell even after his family died," Catherine said. "He told Nathaniel that the land was all he had left of his wife and children, that he would die before he let it go, so Nathaniel obliged him." The simple, brutal honesty of it made Jack's stomach clench. "Did you know?" he asked. "Did you know what your husband had done?" Catherine nodded slowly. "I suspected when the Brennans disappeared, and I knew for certain when Nathaniel came home one night with blood on his hands and lies on his lips. I confronted him, and he told me that if I ever spoke of it to anyone, I would join Henry Brennan in whatever hole he had been thrown into." Jack took the documents she offered, adding them to the ones he had already gathered. "This is enough," he said. "With these, I can prove what Cross has done." Catherine shook her head. "Documents are only as good as the men who read them, and Nathaniel has spent years cultivating relationships with every important man in the territory. You need more than paper evidence. You need witnesses who cannot be intimidated or bought, and you need to survive long enough to present your case." A sound outside made them both freeze, horses approaching fast, and Catherine moved to the window. "They are coming back," she said, her voice urgent now. "Nathaniel must have discovered you escaped the fire. You need to leave immediately." Jack grabbed the documents and started toward the window, but Catherine caught his arm. "Wait, there is something else you should know. The boy, Daniel Brennan, he is not Nathaniel's only enemy. There are other families, other survivors who would testify if they thought they could do so safely. Find them, gather them, and you might have a chance." "Who?" Jack asked. "Where do I find them?" Catherine pulled a piece of paper from the metal box and pressed it into his hand. "Names and locations, as much as I have been able to discover over the years. People Nathaniel has wronged, people who have reason to want him brought to justice. It is not much, but it is something." The horses were in the yard now, and Jack could hear Cross's voice shouting orders. Catherine pushed him toward the window. "Go now," she said, "and if you succeed, if you bring Nathaniel to justice, know that you will have given me something I thought I would never have again, the ability to live with myself." Jack climbed through the window and ran for the trees where Tucker waited. Behind him, he heard the front door crash open and Cross's voice raised in fury as he discovered the theft. Jack did not look back, mounting Tucker and urging the horse into a gallop that carried them away from the ranch and toward whatever slim chance of survival remained. The documents in his shirt felt like they weighed 100 pounds, evidence of murder and theft that could either save Daniel Brennan or get them both killed. Jack thought about Catherine Cross, trapped in a marriage to a monster, spending years trying to atone for crimes she had not committed but had been powerless to prevent. He thought about the names on the paper she had given him, other victims of Cross's greed, other families torn apart by violence and deception. The sun was fully up now, burning away the morning mist and revealing the vast emptiness of the prairie. Jack pushed Tucker hard, heading north toward where he hoped Daniel had gone, hoping that the boy had managed to stay ahead of Cross's men and that the injured mare had carried him far enough to reach safety. The odds were long, Jack knew that. Had known it from the moment he decided to stay at the Brennan Ranch instead of riding away, but something fundamental had changed in him over these past days, some long-dormant sense of purpose awakening from its 3-year sleep. He was done running, done drifting, done pretending that he could escape his past or his nature by simply moving from place to place. The mare had led him to this point, or perhaps he had needed to be led here, needed to find something worth fighting for, needed to discover that he was still capable of caring about justice and truth and the survival of a 14-year-old boy he barely knew. Behind him, Cross and his men were mounting up, preparing to give chase. Ahead, somewhere in the vast expanse of prairie and sky, Daniel Brennan was riding for his life on an injured horse, and Jack Mercer, late of the Union Army and more recently of nowhere in particular, was caught between them, carrying evidence that could destroy a powerful man if only he could survive long enough to use it. Tucker's hooves pounded against the hard ground, carrying them toward whatever ending this story would have. Jack checked his revolver one more time, counted his remaining ammunition, and prepared himself for whatever came next. The prairie wind carried the scent of dust and distant rain, and overhead the hawks circled in their endless hunt. It was, Jack thought, a good day to stand for something, even if that something cost him everything. Jack found Daniel 3 hours later, the boy and the mare both near collapse beside a shallow creek. The mare's bandage had come loose, and fresh blood stained her leg while Daniel slumped in the saddle with the vacant expression of someone who had pushed beyond exhaustion into a state where the body simply continued moving because stopping meant death. When the boy saw Jack approaching, relief and terror warred across his young face, and for a moment Jack thought he might bolt again before recognition finally registered. "It is me," Jack called out, slowing Tucker to a walk. "You are safe now, Daniel." The boy slid from the mare's back and collapsed onto the ground, his legs unable to hold him any longer. Jack dismounted and knelt beside him, offering water from his canteen and speaking in low, reassuring tones until some of the panic left Daniel's eyes. "They are coming," the boy gasped when he could speak. "I heard horses behind me, getting closer. Mr. Cross and his men, they are going to kill us both." "Maybe," Jack admitted, because lying to the boy would serve no purpose. "But maybe not. I have something now that changes the situation." He pulled out the documents Catherine Cross had given him and showed them to Daniel, explaining quickly what he had found and who had helped him. The boy stared at the papers as if they were magical talismans that could ward off the violence pursuing them, and Jack wished he could promise that paper and ink would be enough to protect them from men with guns and no conscience. They rested for 20 minutes, no longer, tending to the mare's wound and letting the horses drink while Jack calculated distances and possibilities. The nearest town with a real lawman was still 2 days' ride away, too far to reach before Cross caught them. But there was a cavalry outpost perhaps 8 hours north, a small garrison that patrolled this section of the territory watching for Indian trouble. If they could reach it, if the soldiers would listen to their story and look at the evidence, then maybe they had a chance. The decision made, they set out again, Jack setting a pace that was fast but not suicidal, mindful of the mare's injury and Daniel's exhaustion. They rode in silence for the most part, conserving energy and listening for sounds of pursuit. Jack kept checking behind them, watching for the dust cloud that would announce Cross's approach, and preparing himself mentally for the fight he knew was coming. It came sooner than he expected. Cross and 4 men appearing on a ridgeline perhaps a mile behind them, close enough that Jack could see the fury in their posture if not their faces. The chase was on in earnest now, and Jack knew with cold certainty that they would not make it to the cavalry outpost before being overtaken. The mare was limping badly, slowing them down, and Daniel was swaying in the saddle with fatigue. "There," Jack said, pointing to a cluster of rocks ahead that rose from the prairie like the ruins of some ancient fortress. "We make our stand there." Daniel nodded, too tired to argue, and they urged the horses toward what would become either their salvation or their grave. The rocks offered good defensive positions and multiple escape routes if things went badly, but they also meant giving up the mobility that was their only real advantage. They reached the rocks with perhaps 10 minutes to spare before Cross's men would be in rifle range. Jack helped Daniel down from the mare and positioned the boy behind the largest boulder, then distributed his remaining ammunition between them. 15 rounds for his revolver, 7 for Daniel's rifle that Jack had retrieved from Tucker's saddle, not much but enough for a fight if they chose their shots carefully. Cross approached slowly, confidently, a man who knew he had his prey cornered and was savoring the moment. He stopped his men just outside rifle range and dismounted, walking forward alone with his hands visible and empty. "Jack," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance, "this has gone far enough. There has been enough killing and enough running. Give me the papers Catherine gave you, and I will let you and the boy ride away. You have my word." The offer surprised Jack, not because he believed it, but because it revealed how badly Cross wanted those documents, badly enough to risk a face-to-face meeting where Jack could shoot him. The man's confidence had been shaken by his wife's betrayal, and the evidence now in Jack's possession, and that fear was making him reckless. "Your word is worthless," Jack called back. "Just like the deed you forged for the Brennan property and all the other lies you have told to cover your crimes." Cross's expression hardened. "You are making a mistake," he said. "Even if you reach the law, even if they listen to your story, I have enough money and influence to make this go away. But if you shoot me now, my men will kill you both, and all you will have accomplished is to make more widows and orphans." The cynical honesty of it was probably meant to be demoralizing, but it had the opposite effect on Jack. This was what he had been fighting against all along, not just one man's greed, but the entire corrupt system that allowed men like Cross to prosper through violence and then buy their way out of consequences. Well, maybe Jack could not change the whole system, but he could make sure that this one man, this one killer, faced justice. "I am not going to shoot you, Cross," Jack called back. "I am going to do something worse. I am going to make sure everyone knows what you are." Then he raised his voice, projecting it toward Cross's men. "Your boss murdered Henry Brennan and stole his land. I have documents that prove it, letters from his own wife detailing years of fraud and murder. If you help him kill us now, you are accomplices to murder, and when the cavalry arrives, and they will arrive, you will hang alongside him." Jack saw uncertainty ripple through the men, saw them exchange glances and shift uncomfortably in their saddles. These were hired hands, not dedicated killers, and the prospect of hanging for Cross's crimes was clearly not something they had signed up for. Cross saw it too, and his face flushed with anger. "They are lies," he shouted. "Lies from a drifter and a disturbed boy who cannot accept that his father abandoned him. Then prove it," Jack said. "Ride with us to the cavalry outpost. Let them examine the evidence, and if I am lying, they will arrest me. But if I am telling the truth, you will face a court-martial for murder." The standoff stretched out, tension building like a storm ready to break. Cross stood in the open ground between his men and Jack's position, calculating odds and outcomes, and Jack could see the moment when the man decided that violence was his only option. Cross's hand moved toward the gun hidden beneath his coat, fast but not fast enough, and Jack's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The hired men did not return fire, instead sitting frozen in their saddles as their boss writhed in the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder. One of them, older than the others, finally dismounted and walked forward with his hands raised. "I am done with this," he called out. "We all are. If this man has been lying to us about his business dealings, then he can face justice without our help." The cavalry patrol arrived 2 hours later. Alerted by a rider one of Cross's former men had sent ahead, they found Jack and Daniel sitting peacefully beside their horses while Cross, his shoulder bandaged with strips torn from Jack's shirt, railed against the injustice of being shot by a trespassing drifter. The lieutenant in charge was young but competent, and he listened to Jack's story with growing interest, especially when shown the documents Catherine Cross had provided. 3 weeks later, Jack stood in a territorial courtroom and watched as Nathaniel Cross was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Catherine Cross testified against her husband, as did 5 other families who came forward after hearing that someone had finally stood up to the man. Daniel Brennan reclaimed his family's ranch, and Jack helped him repair the burned house and begin rebuilding the life that Cross had tried to destroy. When the repairs were finished and Daniel was settled with a hired hand to help him run the place, Jack prepared to move on, to return to his drifting life. But Daniel stopped him at the gate, the same gate where Jack had first seen the abandoned ranch that had changed everything. "Stay," the boy said simply. "This place is too big for one person, and you are the only family I have got left." Jack looked at the ranch, at the rebuilt house and the repaired corrals, at the mare grazing peacefully in the pasture with her leg fully healed. He thought about 3 years of drifting, of running from his past and his purpose, of believing he was better off alone. The injured horse had led him here, or perhaps he had needed to find his way here, needed to discover that redemption was possible, and that home was not a place but a choice you made to stop running. "I will stay," Jack said, and the words felt like a promise he intended to keep.